In the unforgiving Wyoming Territory of 1887, a desperate widow named Rebecca Thompson stood at the crossroads of impossible choices. With winter's brutal grip tightening around her failing homestead and 3 young children depending on her, every decision, she faced a future that seemed darker than the storm clouds gathering over Pine Ridge Mountains. Her husband Michael's sudden death from pneumonia had left her with nothing but debt, a crumbling cabin, and the crushing weight of survival in a land that showed no mercy to the weak. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Then Jake Morrison, the most successful rancher in Eagle Valley, rode up to her door with an offer that defied all logic and challenged everything she thought she knew about hope. His words would echo in her mind for days afterward, bold and impossible as the man who spoke them. But when a woman has lost everything and a confident cowboy promises the impossible, sometimes the only choice left is to believe in miracles. The November wind cut through the gaps in the Thompson cabin walls like a knife through worn fabric, carrying with it the promise of the harshest winter Eagle Valley had seen in a decade. Rebecca Thompson pressed her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stood at the single window, watching her 8-year-old twin sons Danny and Tommy struggle to repair the chicken coop that had collapsed under yesterday's heavy snow. The sight of her boys working with tools too large for their small hands made her chest tight, with a mixture of pride and heartbreak. 6 months. That's how long Michael had been gone, taken by the pneumonia that swept through Cedar Falls like wildfire. In the spring, 6 months of watching their small savings dwindle to nothing while she tried to manage a homestead that had challenged even her capable husband. The chickens were dying off one by one. The last cow had been sold to pay for medicine that came too late, and the vegetable garden lay buried under early snow that refused to melt. Baby Emma stirred in her makeshift cradle, whimpering softly in that way that meant she was hungry again. Rebecca moved to her daughter, lifting the 6-month-old child whose bright blue eyes were so much like Michael's that it sometimes took her breath away. The baby had been born just 2 months before her father's death, a final gift that now felt like both blessing and burden in equal measure. "Mama, the wire's all twisted up," Danny called from outside, his voice carrying the frustration of a child trying to accomplish adult tasks. His brother Tommy stood beside him, holding boards that were clearly too heavy, his face red with exertion and determination. The twins had grown up fast since their father's death, taking on responsibilities that should have belonged to men twice their age. Rebecca shifted Emma to her hip and stepped outside, her worn boots crunching on the frozen ground. The homestead spread before her in all its struggling glory. The barn leaned precariously to one side, its roof sagging under the weight of accumulated snow. The fence posts stood at odd angles, victims of ground that froze and thawed and froze again, pulling everything out of true. The cabin itself, once Michael's pride, now looked like exactly what it was, the desperate shelter of people who had run out of options. "Let me see what I can do," she said, setting Emma down on a blanket near the doorway where she could keep watch while working. The chicken wire had indeed twisted into an impossible tangle, and Rebecca found herself struggling with tools that felt foreign in her hands. Michael had handled all the heavy maintenance, leaving her to manage the house and garden. Now everything fell to her, and each task felt like a test she was destined to fail. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her look up from her work, and what she saw made her stomach clench with anxiety. 3 riders were approaching from the direction of town, and even at a distance, she could recognize the purposeful way they sat their horses. Debt collectors, most likely, or perhaps men from the bank coming to discuss the mortgage payments she'd missed. As they drew closer, Rebecca recognized Samuel Wright from the general store, his round face grim beneath his winter hat. Beside him rode Dr. Foster, whose presence usually meant bad news of one kind or another. But it was the third man who commanded her attention, tall and straight-backed in the saddle, wearing clothes that spoke of prosperity and confidence. She'd never seen him before, but something about his bearing suggested he was someone of importance in these parts. "Mrs. Thompson," Samuel Wright called as they reined in their horses near the cabin. "Hope you don't mind the intrusion. We've come to discuss some business matters." Rebecca wiped her hands on her apron and moved protectively closer to where Emma lay on her blanket. "Mr. Wright, Dr. Foster, she acknowledged with a nod, then looked questioningly at the stranger. This here's Jake Morrison, Dr. Foster said, dismounting with the careful movements of a man whose bones felt every change in the weather. Owns the Morning Star Ranch south of town. Jake, this is Rebecca Thompson. Jake Morrison swung down from his horse with fluid grace, removing his hat to reveal dark hair touched with silver at the temples and eyes the color of storm clouds. He appeared to be in his early 40s, with the weathered face of a man who'd spent his life outdoors, and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to success. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of a man used to being heard and respected. "Ma'am," he said, his tone respectful but direct. "I understand you've been having some difficulties since your husband's passing. I've come to discuss a proposition that might benefit us both." Rebecca felt her spine stiffen with defensive pride. She'd grown weary of well-meaning neighbors who offered charity disguised as business opportunities, their pity poorly hidden behind concerned smiles. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Morrison, but we're managing just fine." Samuel Wright shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, exchanging glances with Dr. Foster. "Rebecca, perhaps you should hear what Jake has to say. Your situation here is more precarious than you might realize." "What Mr. Wright is trying to tell you," Jake said, his tone gentle but honest, "is that you owe the bank more money than this homestead is worth. Your livestock is gone, and winter's coming on hard. Those boys of yours are doing men's work, but they're still children, and that baby needs more than you can provide if things keep going the way they are." The blunt assessment stung because it was true. Rebecca had been telling herself she could make it work, that somehow she'd find a way to turn things around before the real cold set in. But Jake Morrison's words forced her to confront the reality she'd been avoiding. She was failing, and her children were going to pay the price for her stubborn pride. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "What kind of proposition?" she asked quietly, her arms unconsciously tightening around Emma. Jake stepped closer, close enough that she could see the sincerity in his gray eyes. "I need a wife, Mrs. Thompson. My spread is successful, but it's no place for a bachelor to rattle around alone. And you need security for yourself and your children. I'm proposing a marriage of convenience that would solve both our problems." The audacity of the suggestion left Rebecca momentarily speechless. Marriage proposals from virtual strangers weren't unheard of on the frontier, where practical considerations often outweighed romantic notions. But something in Jake Morrison's manner suggested this was more than a simple business arrangement. "I barely know you," she managed to say. "That's true," Jake acknowledged. "But I know enough about you to respect what you've tried to accomplish here. It takes courage to keep fighting when everything's against you. That's the kind of woman I'd want as a partner." Danny and Tommy had stopped their work on the chicken coop and were listening with the intense concentration children brought to adult conversations that might affect their lives. Rebecca saw the hope beginning to kindle in their young faces and felt her heart break a little more. They deserved better than this constant struggle, better than a mother who couldn't provide basic security. "What exactly are you offering?" she asked, forcing herself to consider the proposal practically rather than emotionally. Jake's expression grew serious, and when he spoke, his words carried the weight of a man making a binding commitment. "I'm offering you a home where your children will never go hungry, never go cold, never have to worry about whether there'll be a roof over their heads tomorrow. I'm offering to adopt those boys legally, give them the Morrison name and everything that comes with it. And I'm offering something else." He paused, and Rebecca found herself holding her breath, waiting for whatever impossible thing he might say next. "I'm offering to give you 7 sons by Christmas." The silence that followed his words seemed to stretch forever. Dr. Foster's eyebrows shot up toward his hairline, while Samuel Wright's mouth fell open in surprise. Rebecca stared at Jake Morrison as if he'd just claimed he could make the sun rise in the west. 7 sons by Christmas," she repeated slowly, certain she'd misheard. "Mr. Morrison, it's November. Christmas is 6 weeks away. Even if we married tomorrow, that's not possible." Jake's mouth curved in what might have been a smile. "Mrs. Thompson, I didn't say I'd father 7 sons by Christmas. I said I'd give you 7 sons. There's a difference." The distinction puzzled her, but before she could ask for clarification, Jake continued, speaking with the confidence of a man who'd thought through every aspect of his proposal. My ranch is profitable enough to support a large family. Your boys would become my sons the moment we married. That gives you 3 sons to start with. I know of 4 other boys in this territory who need homes, orphans and children whose families can't care for them. Good boys who deserve better than they're getting. By Christmas, if you'll have me, you could have 7 sons and the security that comes with being married to a man who can provide for all of them. Rebecca's mind reeled as she tried to process what he was suggesting. It wasn't just marriage. He was proposing, but the creation of an entire family through adoption and determination. The scope of his vision was breathtaking and terrifying in equal measure. Why? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Why would you want to take on so much responsibility? 7 children, a woman you barely know? Jake's expression grew thoughtful, and for the first time since his arrival, she saw something vulnerable beneath his confident exterior. Because I've spent the last 5 years building a ranch that could support generations, and I have no one to leave it to. Because I grew up in an orphanage and know what it means to need someone to believe in you. And because I've watched you these past months, seen how you've fought to keep your family together against impossible odds. That kind of loyalty and determination is exactly what those boys need. The revelation that he'd been observing her situation for months should have made her angry, but instead it raised different questions. You've been watching us? I've been aware of your struggles, Jake corrected. This is a small community, Mrs. Thompson. When a widow with 3 young children is trying to make it alone, people notice. I've been waiting for the right time to approach you, wanting to be sure my offer would be welcome rather than insulting. Danny stepped forward, his young face serious with the weight of adult concerns. Mister, are you saying you'd really want me and Tommy for sons? Even though we're not your blood? Jake knelt to bring himself to the boy's eye level, his weathered hands gentle as he placed them on Danny's small shoulders. Son, family isn't just about blood. It's about people who choose to care for each other, who work together and look out for each other no matter what. If your mama agrees to marry me, you and Tommy would be my sons in every way that matters. Tommy moved closer to his twin, his eyes wide with possibility. Would we get to live on a real ranch? With horses and cattle? You would, Jake confirmed. And you'd learn to work the land properly, learn skills that would serve you your whole lives. You'd have your own rooms, enough food every day, and the chance to go to school when the weather permits. Rebecca watched her sons' faces transform as they absorbed Jake's promises, and she felt the last of her resistance beginning to crumble. For months, she'd been focused on mere survival, on getting through each day without losing anything else. Jake Morrison was offering them the chance not just to survive, but to thrive. The other boys, she said, her voice stronger now. Tell me about them. Jake stood, his expression growing serious as he outlined the children he had in mind. There's Lucas, age 10, whose parents died in a wagon accident last spring. He's been staying with distant relatives who can barely feed their own children. There's Benjamin and his little brother Joseph, ages 9 and 6, whose father abandoned them when their mother died. They're currently in the county orphanage. And there's David, age 7, whose family lost everything in a fire. He's been working for his keep at various farms, but he needs a real home. Each name, each story, painted a picture of children who faced the same uncertain future that threatened her own sons. Rebecca found herself imagining what it would mean to provide security not just for Danny, Tommy, and Emma, but for 4 other children who needed someone to believe in their worth. This is a lot to consider, she said, though even as she spoke the words, she could feel her decision crystallizing. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford when her children's welfare was at stake. I understand, Jake said, but I need an answer soon. Winter's coming hard, and if we're going to make this work, we need to move quickly. Those boys I mentioned won't survive another winter in their current situations. Dr. Foster cleared his throat, drawing attention back to the immediate practicalities. Rebecca, I've delivered babies throughout this territory for 20 years. Jake Morrison is known as a man of his word. If he says he'll provide for 7 children, you can trust that he means it. Samuel Wright nodded agreement. Jake's ranch is one of the most prosperous in the territory. He's got the resources to back up his promises. Rebecca looked around at her failing homestead, at the cabin with its sagging roof and drafty walls, at the children who deserved so much more than she could give them. Then she looked at Jake Morrison, this confident stranger who offered not just rescue but transformation. If I agreed, she said slowly, what would you expect from me? What kind of marriage are you proposing? Jake's answer came without hesitation, as if he'd anticipated the question. I'd expect partnership, Mrs. Thompson. Someone to help me turn a successful ranch into a real home. Someone to help raise 7 boys to be good men. As for the marriage itself, that would develop naturally over time, or it wouldn't. I'm not looking to force affection that doesn't exist. The honesty of his response impressed her. Too many frontier marriages were built on desperation and unspoken expectations that led to resentment. Jake Morrison was offering something different, a foundation of mutual respect that might grow into something deeper. How long do I have to decide? She asked. Until Sunday, Jake replied. If you agree, we'll be married next week and start bringing the other boys home immediately. By Christmas, you'll have the family I've promised. 3 days. Rebecca's mind raced as she considered everything that would need to happen if she accepted his proposal, leaving the homestead that represented Michael's dreams, trusting her children's future to a man she'd known for less than an hour, becoming the mother to 7 boys when she sometimes felt overwhelmed caring for 3 children. But as she looked at Danny and Tommy, saw the hope shining in their eyes as they imagined a future with enough food and warm beds and the security of a father's protection, Rebecca knew her choice was already made. Sometimes survival required leaping into the unknown, trusting that solid ground would appear beneath your feet. Mr. Morrison, she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the decision she was making. I'll give you my answer on Sunday after church. But I want you to know that if I agree to this, I'll expect you to keep every promise you've made. 7 sons by Christmas, security for all of them, and the chance for my children to build better lives than I can provide alone. Jake nodded solemnly, understanding the weight of the commitment he was making. You have my word, Mrs. Thompson. 7 sons by Christmas, and everything that goes with it. As the 3 men prepared to leave, Jake paused beside his horse, looking back at Rebecca with an expression she couldn't quite read. Mrs. Thompson, I want you to know that this isn't charity. I need what you can provide as much as you need what I'm offering. A house isn't a home without a family to fill it, and a ranch isn't a legacy without children to inherit it. You'd be doing me a favor as much as I'd be doing one for you. After they rode away, Rebecca stood in the gathering dusk with Emma in her arms and her sons beside her, all of them staring at the horizon where Jake Morrison had disappeared. The wind still cut through the cabin walls, the roof still sagged under the weight of snow, and the future still held 1,000 uncertainties. But for the first time since Michael's death, Rebecca felt something besides desperation filling her chest. She felt the dangerous, wonderful stirring of hope. Part 2. The struggle deepens. The 3 days that followed Jake Morrison's unprecedented proposal stretched before Rebecca like an eternity filled with impossible decisions. Each morning brought new reminders of her desperate circumstances, as if the Wyoming winter itself conspired to drive home the reality of her situation. The thermometer outside the cabin door registered temperatures that made her breath freeze the moment she stepped outside, and the wind howled through the mountains with a ferocity that promised worse to come. On Thursday morning, Rebecca woke to discover that 2 more chickens had died during the night, their bodies frozen solid in the coop that Danny and Tommy had worked so hard to repair. The loss meant fewer eggs, less protein for growing children, and another nail in the coffin of her hopes for self-sufficiency. She buried the birds in ground so hard it took her an hour to dig graves barely deep enough to keep scavengers away. Baby Emma had developed a troubling cough that echoed through the cabin's thin walls, a wet, persistent sound that reminded Rebecca too clearly of the illness that had taken Michael. Without money for Dr. Foster's services, she could only watch helplessly as her daughter struggled with congestion that seemed to worsen with each passing hour. The baby's appetite had diminished, her usually bright eyes dulled with the exhaustion of fighting to breathe, and Rebecca found herself checking on the child throughout the night, terrified of what she might find. The twins had responded to Jake Morrison's visit with a mixture of excitement and confusion that manifested in whispered conversations they thought their mother couldn't hear. Danny had always been the more practical of the two, and Rebecca caught him making lists of everything they owned, as if trying to calculate what they might take to a new life at the Morning Star Ranch. Tommy, the dreamer, had begun talking about horses and cattle as though their future was already decided, his 8-year-old imagination painting pictures of adventures that made his eyes shine with anticipation. "Mama," Danny said on Friday morning as he helped her strain the last of their milk through a cloth that had seen better days. "If we went to live with Mr. Morrison, would Papa be angry with us for leaving his homestead?" The question hit Rebecca like a physical blow, striking at the heart of her own internal struggle. Michael had poured his dreams into this land, had seen it as the foundation for generations of Thompsons who would prosper in the American West. To abandon it felt like betraying not just his memory, but the sacrifice he'd made in bringing them here from Ohio. "Your papa wanted us to be safe and happy," she said carefully, choosing words that honored both Michael's memory and their current reality. "He wouldn't want us to suffer trying to hold on to something we can't manage alone." But even as she spoke the reassuring words, Rebecca wrestled with her own guilt. Michael had believed so strongly in the homestead's potential, had worked himself into exhaustion trying to make it profitable. The vegetables they'd grown in the summer had been abundant, the soil rich and dark when properly tended. The creek that ran through their property provided reliable water even in drought years, and the south-facing slope would have been perfect for the orchard Michael had planned to plant in the spring. All of that potential would be lost if she accepted Jake Morrison's proposal. Some other family would claim the homestead, would build on the foundation Michael had laid, would harvest the fruits of his labor and vision. The thought made her chest tight with loss that felt almost as acute as Michael's death itself. Yet the alternative was watching her children suffer through a winter that grew harsher with each passing day. The cabin's wood-burning stove devoured fuel at an alarming rate, and her supply of cut logs wouldn't last until February even with strict rationing. The root cellar held barely enough preserved food to feed 3 people through December, much less carry them to spring planting season. And baby Emma's worsening cough served as a constant reminder that children could die from exposure and malnutrition as surely as adults. Friday afternoon brought an unexpected visitor in the form of Martha Hayes, their nearest neighbor and the unofficial moral authority of their small community. Martha arrived with a basket of fresh bread and a determined expression that warned Rebecca she was about to receive advice whether she wanted it or not. "Rebecca Thompson," Martha said without preamble as she settled her substantial frame into the cabin's single comfortable chair. "The whole territory is talking about Jake Morrison's proposal. I've come to make sure you understand exactly what you're considering." Rebecca poured coffee from the pot that always sat warming on the stove, grateful for any distraction from her circular worrying. "What are people saying?" "They're saying you'd be a fool not to accept," Martha replied. Bluntly, Jake Morrison is the most eligible bachelor in 3 counties, with a ranch that stretches farther than most men can ride in a day. He could have his pick of any unmarried woman from here to Denver, yet he's chosen you. The observation carried an undercurrent of puzzlement that Rebecca found less than flattering. "You make it sound like I should be grateful for any man's attention." Martha waved a dismissive hand. "Don't twist my words, child. I'm saying Jake Morrison doesn't make offers lightly. If he's promised to provide for 7 children, he's already calculated the cost and decided he can afford it. That kind of commitment doesn't come from a man looking for a housekeeper with benefits." The crude assessment made Rebecca's cheeks burn, but she couldn't deny the practical wisdom behind Martha's words. Jake Morrison's proposal went far beyond the typical frontier marriage of convenience. The scope of his vision suggested motivations that ran deeper than simple companionship or domestic help. "Tell me about him," Rebecca said, settling across from Martha with her own cup of coffee. "What do you know about Jake Morrison that might help me make this decision?" Martha's expression grew thoughtful as she considered the question. "He came to this territory about 7 years ago, just after the railroad pushed through. Bought the old Henderson spread when they gave up and moved back east, then spent 2 years expanding it into what it is now. Runs about 3,000 head of cattle, employs a dozen men year-round, and has never defaulted on a debt or broken his word to anyone I know." The recitation of Jake's accomplishments was impressive, but Rebecca found herself more interested in the man behind the success. What about his personal life? Why hasn't he married before now? "That's the question everyone asks," Martha admitted. He keeps to himself mostly, comes to town for supplies and church services, but doesn't socialize much. There's been speculation about a woman back east, maybe someone who died or left him, but Jake's never confirmed anything. What I can tell you is that he treats his employees fairly, pays his bills promptly, and has never given anyone cause to question his character. Baby Emma chose that moment to begin crying, the sound sharp with distress that made both women look toward the makeshift cradle with concern. Rebecca lifted her daughter, feeling the heat that indicated fever, noting how the baby's breathing seemed more labored than it had been that morning. Emma's tiny fists waved weakly, her usually active limbs showing the lethargy that spoke of serious illness. "She's getting worse," Martha observed with the brutal honesty of a woman who'd seen too many frontier children fail to thrive. That cough is settling deep in her chest, and without proper medical care. She didn't finish the sentence, but Rebecca understood the implication. Baby Emma needed warmth, nutrition, and medical attention that Rebecca couldn't provide. The thought of losing another family member to circumstances beyond her control made her feel physically ill. Jake Morrison's ranch house has steam heat, Martha continued quietly. Real windows with glass, a kitchen with running water, and Dr. Foster makes regular visits to check on the hands. That baby would have every advantage there. The temptation to accept Jake's proposal purely for Emma's sake was overwhelming, but Rebecca forced herself to consider the broader implications. What about the other children he mentioned? Do you know anything about them? Martha nodded grimly. I know Lucas Walsh, the 10-year-old whose parents died in that wagon accident. He's been staying with his aunt and uncle, but they've got 6 children of their own and barely enough food to go around. The boy's been doing man's work since spring, and it shows in how thin he's gotten. As for the Benjamin and Joseph Miller, those boys have been in the county orphanage since their father disappeared. The conditions there are adequate, but that's the best you can say. Each name, each story, added weight to the decision. Rebecca faced. Jake Morrison wasn't just offering to rescue her family. He was proposing to save 4 other children whose situations were equally desperate. The moral complexity of refusing his offer when it would benefit so many innocent lives made her stomach clench with guilt and uncertainty. There's something else you should consider, Martha said, her voice dropping to the confidential tone she used for sharing particularly important gossip. Winter's supposed to be the worst in decades. The almanac predicted it. The animals are growing extra thick coats, and the indigenous tribes have moved their camps to more protected areas. If that's true, homesteads like yours won't survive. The lucky families will lose their livestock and crops. The unlucky ones will lose much more. The ominous prediction aligned with Rebecca's own observations about the early onset of brutal cold and the unusual behavior of wildlife in the area. She'd noticed how the deer had moved to lower elevations weeks earlier than usual, how the birds had disappeared almost overnight, how even the hardy mountain flowers had withered and died before their normal season ended. Saturday arrived with a blizzard that transformed the landscape into a white wilderness where familiar landmarks disappeared beneath drifts that reached the cabin's windows. The storm struck with such sudden ferocity that Rebecca barely managed to retrieve the last of their firewood before visibility dropped to mere feet. Danny and Tommy helped her secure the shutters and pile snow against the cabin's foundation for extra insulation, but the howling wind found every gap in their defenses. Inside the cabin, the 4 of them huddled around the stove while the blizzard raged outside with a violence that made the entire structure shudder. Emma's cough had worsened overnight, developing the distinctive bark that Rebecca recognized from too many frontier winters. The baby's breathing was shallow and rapid, her small body burning with fever that no amount of cool cloth seemed to reduce. She needs a doctor, Danny said with the solemn certainty of a child who'd already learned too much about loss. Mama, baby Emma sounds like Papa did before. He couldn't finish the sentence, but Rebecca understood what he was trying to say. Michael's final illness had begun with symptoms remarkably similar to what Emma was experiencing. The thought of history repeating itself, of watching another family member slip away while she stood helpless, made Rebecca's decision crystallize with sudden clarity. Boys, she said, gathering Danny and Tommy close while Emma lay listless in her arms, I want you to listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you. Tomorrow, after church, I'm going to accept Mr. Morrison's proposal. We're going to marry him and go live at his ranch, and we're going to become a family with the other boys he mentioned." The twins exchanged glances that communicated volumes, in the way only siblings could manage. Relief, excitement, and a touch of nervousness flickered across their young faces as they processed the magnitude of the change their mother was announcing. "Will we still be Thompsons?" Tommy asked, his voice small in the storm's roar. "You'll always be your father's sons," Rebecca assured him. "But you'll also become Morrisons, with all the security and opportunities that name carries. Mr. Morrison promised to adopt you legally, which means you'll inherit part of his ranch someday." The concept of inheritance was probably too complex for 8-year-old minds to fully grasp, but Rebecca could see them trying to understand the implications of belonging to a prosperous family rather than struggling alone. For children who'd known nothing but uncertainty since their father's death, the promise of stability must seem almost too good to believe. As the blizzard continued through the night, Rebecca lay awake listening to Emma's labored breathing and the wind's relentless assault on their inadequate shelter. The cabin that had once represented hope and new beginnings now felt like a trap, its thin walls and leaking roof no match for the forces arrayed against them. Every gust that rattled the windows, every draft that found its way inside despite their efforts, reinforced her conviction that accepting Jake Morrison's proposal was the only rational choice available. But beyond the practical considerations lay deeper questions that kept her staring into the darkness long after the twins had fallen asleep. What kind of man offered to care for 7 children without expecting anything substantial in return? What motivations drove someone with Jake Morrison's resources to seek out a struggling widow rather than pursuing any of the eligible women who would surely welcome his attention? And perhaps most importantly, what would it mean for her own identity to transform from independent homesteader to dependent wife in the space of a single ceremony? The storm finally exhausted itself near dawn, leaving behind a world transformed by snow so deep it erased the familiar boundaries of their small domain. When Rebecca pushed open the cabin door, she found drifts that reached halfway up the walls, paths that had disappeared entirely, and a silence so complete it felt almost sacred. The beauty of the pristine landscape was undeniable, but so was its hostility to human survival. Part 3. The unexpected encounter. Sunday morning dawned clear and bitter cold, with sunlight that turned the snow-covered valley into a glittering expanse that hurt the eyes to look upon. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind temperatures so low that Rebecca's breath crystallized instantly when she stepped outside to assess the storm's damage. The path to the barn had vanished under drifts that would take hours to shovel, and the chicken coop was buried so completely that only the peak of its roof remained visible above the white surface. Rebecca's first thought was for the remaining chickens, but when she and the twins finally dug their way to the coop's entrance, they found only silence within. The bitter cold had claimed the last of their flock during the night, leaving them without even the meager source of protein the eggs had provided. The loss felt like a final judgment on her ability to sustain her family through the winter months that stretched ahead. Baby Emma's condition had deteriorated further during the night, her small body racked with coughing fits that left her gasping for breath. The fever had spiked high enough to make her skin burning hot to the touch, and her usual appetite had disappeared entirely. Rebecca tried spooning warm milk into the baby's mouth, but Emma turned away weakly, too exhausted by illness to take the nourishment she desperately needed. "We have to get to church," Rebecca told the twins as she bundled Emma in every blanket they owned. "Dr. Foster will be there, and maybe he can help with the baby's breathing." The journey to Cedar Falls normally took 30 minutes on foot, but the snow-clogged roads transformed it into an ordeal that tested all their endurance. Danny and Tommy took turns breaking trail through drifts that sometimes reached their waists, while Rebecca followed in their footsteps carrying Emma wrapped against the cold. The baby's labored breathing created small clouds of vapor that crystallized on the blankets, and her silence was more frightening than crying would have been. Other families were making the same difficult trek to Sunday services, their dark figures moving across the white landscape like ink spots on paper. The Hayes passed them in a sleigh pulled by their sturdy draft horse, and Martha called out an offer of assistance that Rebecca accepted gratefully. Climbing into the sleigh's relative warmth felt like salvation, and Emma's breathing seemed to ease slightly once she was protected from the biting wind. That baby needs immediate attention, Martha observed with the bluntness that characterized all her observations. Dr. Foster will want to examine her thoroughly, and I suspect he'll recommend keeping her somewhere warm and dry until this illness passes. The Cedar Falls Church stood like a beacon of civilization against the harsh landscape, its white-painted walls and simple steeple offering the promise of community and shared warmth. Smoke rose from the chimney, indicating that someone had arrived, early to build up the fires that would make the sanctuary bearable for morning worship. The bell tower held a bronze bell donated by the territorial government, and its clear tones carried across the valley to announce the beginning of services. Inside, the church was filled with families who'd braved the storm to maintain their weekly tradition of communal worship and social connection. The pot-bellied stove at the front of the sanctuary radiated heat that made the building feel tropical compared to the outdoor temperatures, and the familiar hymns created an atmosphere of comfort that Rebecca had desperately needed. Dr. Foster approached her immediately after the opening prayer, his weathered face creased with concern as he examined Emma without being asked. His hands were gentle but thorough as he listened to the baby's labored breathing, felt for fever, and checked her responsiveness to stimuli. The diagnosis was written in his expression before he spoke the words aloud. Pneumonia, he said quietly, confirming Rebecca's worst fears. She needs warmth, proper nutrition, and medications I can provide, but not in that cabin of yours. The baby won't survive another night in those conditions. The brutal assessment hit Rebecca like a physical blow, though she'd suspected as much from Emma's symptoms. Pneumonia was the frontier killer that claimed more children than accidents or wild animals, the invisible enemy that struck hardest during the brutal winter months when families were trapped in inadequate shelters, with poor ventilation and insufficient heat. "What do you recommend?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Immediate relocation to somewhere with proper heating and clean air circulation," Dr. Foster replied. "My house would be suitable, or perhaps the hotel in town, though that would be expensive for an extended stay." Before Rebecca could respond to the doctor's recommendations, a commotion near the church entrance drew everyone's attention. Jake Morrison had arrived, stamping snow from his boots and removing a heavy coat that spoke of quality and warmth. He moved through the congregation with the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to respect, nodding to acquaintances and making his way directly toward Rebecca with purposeful strides. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, his gray eyes immediately focusing on the bundle in her arms. "I heard about the blizzard's damage to your homestead. How are you and the children managing?" The question was asked with genuine concern rather than mere politeness, and Rebecca found herself responding with more honesty than she'd intended. "Baby Emma has pneumonia, according to Dr. Foster. The cold claimed our remaining chickens, and the cabin isn't warm enough for a sick child." Jake's expression darkened with what looked like anger, though she sensed it was directed at circumstances rather than people. "Dr. Foster, what does the baby need for recovery?" "Consistent warmth, proper nutrition, and medications I can provide," the doctor replied. "But most importantly, she needs to be moved immediately to suitable accommodations." Without hesitation, Jake stepped closer to Rebecca, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to solving problems quickly and decisively. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm prepared to take you and the children to my ranch house immediately after services. Emma can receive proper care there while you consider my proposal in comfort rather than desperation." The offer was generous beyond anything Rebecca had expected, but it also complicated her decision in ways she hadn't anticipated. Accepting shelter at Jake's ranch would create obligations and expectations that might influence her judgment about marriage. Yet Emma's worsening condition made the choice academic. Her daughter's life trumped concerns about propriety or independence. "I accept your offer of shelter," she said formally, aware that half the congregation was listening to their conversation with undisguised interest. "But I want it understood that accepting help doesn't automatically mean accepting your marriage proposal." Jake nodded with what looked like approval rather than disappointment. "Understood completely. My offer of shelter has no strings attached. You'll have time to recover your strength and make decisions based on clear thinking rather than crisis." Reverend Carter chose that moment to call for quiet, so the service could continue. But Rebecca noticed how many meaningful glances were exchanged throughout the congregation as word of Jake's offer spread through whispered conversations. By evening, everyone in the territory would know that Jake Morrison had essentially rescued the Thompson family from their failing homestead. The sermon that morning focused on divine providence and the importance of recognizing God's hand in unexpected blessings, themes that felt particularly relevant to Rebecca's situation. Reverend Carter spoke about how sometimes salvation came through human agents who acted as instruments of divine will, and how pride could prevent people from accepting help that was freely offered with pure motives. As the service concluded, and families began preparing for the journey home, Jake approached Rebecca with practical efficiency that impressed her despite her emotional turmoil. He'd already arranged for one of his men to bring a sleigh suitable for transporting a sick baby, complete with heated bricks wrapped in flannel and extra blankets that looked expensive enough to cost more than Rebecca's entire wardrobe. "Mrs. Thompson," he said as he helped her settle Emma in the sleigh's protected passenger compartment, "I want you to know that my ranch house has a nursery that hasn't been used in years. It's warm, quiet, and fully equipped for infant care. Emma will have everything she needs for recovery." The mention of a nursery raised questions about Jake's past that Rebecca filed away for future consideration. Men didn't typically maintain furnished nurseries unless they'd expected to need them, which suggested either previous children or concrete plans for future family that had been somehow interrupted. Danny and Tommy climbed into the sleigh with barely contained excitement, their eyes wide as they took in the quality of the vehicle and the powerful horses that would pull them to their temporary new home. For children who'd known only struggle and deprivation, the sleigh's comfortable appointments and the promise of genuine warmth must have seemed like entry into a fairy tale. The journey to the Morning Star Ranch took less than an hour, but it carried them into a different world entirely. Jake's property began at a gate marked with an elaborate wrought iron sign, and the road that led to the main house was well maintained. Despite the recent blizzard, snow had been cleared from the drive, indicating that Jake employed enough men to handle such tasks promptly and efficiently. The ranch house itself took Rebecca's breath away with its size and obvious quality. Built from local stone and timber, it rose 2 full stories with a wraparound porch that promised comfortable outdoor living during warmer months. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys, suggesting a heating system that could warm the entire structure evenly, and the windows glowed with warm light that spoke of electricity or high-quality oil lamps. "It's like a palace," Tommy whispered as the sleigh pulled up to the front entrance, and Rebecca couldn't argue with his assessment. The building was larger than the church in Cedar Falls, more substantial than any private residence she'd ever seen, and clearly designed to house a family. Much larger than the solitary man who currently occupied it. Jake helped her down from the sleigh with the courtesy due a lady rather than a desperate widow seeking charity, his hands steady and strong as he ensured her safe passage through snow that had been neatly shoveled from the walkway. The front door opened before they reached it, revealing a middle-aged woman whose competent bearing and clean apron marked her as the household's housekeeper. "Mrs. Chun," Jake said to the woman, "this is Mrs. Thompson and her children. Emma, the baby, has pneumonia and needs immediate attention in the nursery. Please prepare the guest rooms for Mrs. Thompson and the boys, and send someone to fetch Dr. Foster as soon as possible." The housekeeper's response was immediate and efficient, taking charge of Emma with the practiced movements of someone experienced in caring for sick children. She spoke with a slight accent that suggested Chinese heritage, and her gentle handling of the baby showed both competence and genuine concern for the infant's welfare. "The nursery is prepared and heated," Mrs. Chun assured Rebecca as she led the way into the house. "I have experience with children's illnesses, and Dr. Foster visits regularly to check on the ranch hands. Your baby will receive excellent care." The interior of Jake's home exceeded even Rebecca's elevated expectations. The front hall featured polished hardwood floors covered with colorful rugs, and a staircase that curved gracefully to the second floor. Oil paintings hung on walls papered with patterns that spoke of expensive taste, and the furniture visible in adjoining rooms looked like it belonged in a wealthy Eastern home rather than a frontier ranch house. "This way to the nursery," Mrs. Chin said, leading them up the staircase to a room that made Rebecca's heart clench with emotion. The space was clearly designed for children, with a crib that looked handmade from fine wood, a rocking chair positioned near windows that would provide natural light, and shelves lined with toys and books that had obviously been waiting for young occupants. Whose nursery was this? Rebecca asked, unable to contain her curiosity about the room's obvious preparation. Jake's expression grew distant as he surveyed the unused furniture and carefully arranged decorations. I built this room 7 years ago when I thought I'd be needing it. Life took different turns than I expected, but I've kept it ready just in case the opportunity arose to fill it with children's laughter. The explanation was vague enough to raise more questions than it answered, but Rebecca sensed this wasn't the time to press for details about Jake's past disappointments. Emma's immediate needs took precedence over curiosity about her host's personal history. Mrs. Chun took charge of the baby with professional efficiency, undressing Emma carefully and examining her with the thoroughness of someone who understood infant illnesses. The housekeeper's gentle touch and soothing voice seemed to calm the sick child, and for the first time in days, Emma's breathing appeared to ease slightly in the warm, humid air of the properly heated room. The baby will recover, Mrs. Chun announced with quiet confidence after completing her examination. The pneumonia is serious but not advanced. With proper care, warmth, and nutrition, she should begin improving within days. The assurance felt like the first good news Rebecca had received in months, and she found herself blinking back tears of relief that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. Emma would survive, would grow up healthy and strong, in surroundings that could provide everything a child needed to thrive. Part 4. Cautious cooperation. The first night at the Morningstar Ranch passed like a dream sequence where Rebecca found herself questioning whether her family's transformation was real or simply wishful thinking born of desperation. She'd been given a guest room that was larger than the entire living area of their cabin, with a bed that felt impossibly soft after months of sleeping on a straw mattress, and windows that looked out over snow-covered pastures that stretched to the horizon. Emma slept peacefully in the nursery under Mrs. Chin's watchful care, her breathing easier than it had been in days thanks to the warm, humid air that circulated throughout the house. The baby's fever had broken sometime during the night, and she'd taken milk eagerly for the first time since becoming ill. The transformation in her condition felt miraculous, though Rebecca understood it was simply the result of proper medical care and adequate shelter. Danny and Tommy had been given a room that connected to Rebecca's through a shared sitting area, and their excitement about their temporary accommodations had kept them awake long past their usual bedtime. She'd heard them whispering about the electric lights, the indoor plumbing, and the promise of hot meals prepared by a real cook rather than whatever their mother could manage from dwindling supplies. Morning brought the smell of bacon and fresh bread drifting up from the kitchen, along with sounds of household activity that spoke of a well-run establishment. Rebecca dressed carefully in her best dress, wanting to present herself as a lady rather than a charity case, though the contrast between her worn clothing and the room's elegant furnishings made her acutely aware of the social gap between herself and Jake Morrison. When she descended to the main floor, she found Jake already seated at a dining room table that could have accommodated a dozen people. He rose courteously as she entered, pulling out a chair with the automatic politeness that marked a man raised with proper manners. The table was set with china and silver that looked like it belonged in a fine hotel, and the spread of food available would have fed her family for a week. "Good morning, Mrs. Thompson," Jake said as he resumed his seat. "I trust you and the children slept well?" "Better than we have in months," Rebecca admitted honestly. Emma's breathing has improved dramatically, and the boys were fascinated by the electric lighting in their room. Jake smiled at the mention of her son's wonder. "I had electricity installed 2 years ago when the lines reached this far from town. It seems like a luxury until you've experienced the convenience. Then it becomes a necessity." The boys are welcome to explore the house and learn how everything works. The casual generosity of the offer struck Rebecca as typical of the man's approach to hospitality. Jake Morrison seemed genuinely pleased to share his home's amenities with guests, treating their presence as a pleasure rather than an inconvenience. The attitude was refreshing after months of feeling like a burden to everyone who'd offered assistance. "About your proposal," Rebecca began, then paused as Mrs. Chun appeared with fresh coffee and warm biscuits that smelled like heaven. "I've been thinking about what you said, about the other children who need homes." Jake's expression grew serious as he set down his coffee cup. What specifically would you like to know? I want to meet them, Rebecca said with sudden decision. If I'm going to help raise these boys, I need to understand what we'd be taking on. Each child will have his own personality, his own needs, his own way of dealing with whatever trauma brought him to his current situation. The request seemed to please Jake, whose face brightened with what looked like approval. I was hoping you'd say that. I've arranged for us to visit the orphanage this afternoon, and I've sent word to the families caring for Lucas and David that we'd like to meet with them this week. The efficiency with which he'd anticipated her request suggested that Jake had been thinking several steps ahead in his planning. Rebecca found herself impressed by his thoroughness, though it also raised questions about how long he'd been considering this particular solution to both their problems. Tell me about the ranch, she said, deflecting her thoughts towards safer topics. How did you build all this in just 7 years? Jake's expression grew thoughtful as he considered how much detail to share about his success. I came here with capital from business investments back east, plus experience in cattle ranching from my younger days in Texas. The key was recognizing that this valley had everything needed for successful ranching: good grass, reliable water, and proximity to railroad transportation for getting cattle to market. The explanation was logical and straightforward, but Rebecca sensed there were layers of complexity he wasn't sharing. Men didn't typically accumulate the kind of capital Jake possessed without taking significant risks or possessing unusual skills. His success felt almost too complete, too perfectly executed to be the result of simple good planning and hard work. What about the men who work for you? She asked. How do they feel about the possibility of your marrying and bringing 7 children to live here? I employ 12 men year-round, plus additional hands during roundup and branding seasons. Jake replied, they're good men who understand that a ranch needs family to give it purpose beyond mere profit. Most of them have been with me for several years, and they've expressed support for my plans to marry and raise children here. The fact that Jake had discussed his marriage plans with his employees suggested he'd been considering the idea for some time rather than making an impulsive decision based on Rebecca's circumstances. She found herself wondering what had prompted him to choose her specifically, when presumably he could have approached any number of eligible women with his proposal. Danny and Tommy appeared in the dining room doorway, freshly washed and wearing expressions of barely contained excitement. They'd obviously been exploring the house and discovering amenities that seemed magical to children raised in frontier poverty. Their presence reminded Rebecca that whatever decision she made would affect them as much as herself. Boys, Jake said, rising to greet them with the same courtesy he'd shown Rebecca. I was hoping you'd join us for breakfast. Mrs. Chin has prepared enough food to feed a small army, and I hate to see it go to waste. The twins settled at the table with the careful politeness of children who understood they were guests in an important person's home. But their eyes were wide with wonder as they took in the abundance of food available, the quality of the dishes they were eating from, and the casual luxury that surrounded them in every direction. Mr. Morrison, Danny said with the seriousness of an 8-year-old conducting important business. If we came to live here, would you really adopt us legal and proper? I would, Jake confirmed without hesitation. You'd become Danny Morrison and Tommy Morrison, with all the rights and responsibilities that come with bearing my name. That includes inheritance of part of this ranch when you're old enough to manage it responsibly. The concept of inheritance was probably beyond the twins' full comprehension, but Rebecca could see them processing the idea that they might someday own part of the vast property they were exploring. For children who'd never owned anything more valuable than their father's worn tools, the promise of land ownership must seem almost incomprehensible. What would we have to do? Tommy asked with practical curiosity. I mean, if we were your sons, what would you expect from us? Jake's answer came with the measured consideration of a man who'd thought seriously about the responsibilities of parenthood. I'd expect you to work hard in school, to help with ranch chores appropriate to your age, and to treat everyone on this property with respect. I'd expect honesty, even when the truth might get you in trouble. And I'd expect you to look out for each other and for the other boys who'd become your brothers. The expectations he outlined were reasonable rather than demanding, focused on character development rather than mere obedience. Rebecca found herself comparing Jake's approach to Michael's parenting style and discovering surprising similarities in their emphasis on responsibility and mutual respect. After breakfast, Jake offered to show them around the ranch operations, and Rebecca accepted eagerly. Understanding the source of Jake's prosperity would help her evaluate the security he was offering, and she was genuinely curious about how such a successful enterprise functioned on a daily basis. The tour began in the barn, a structure that impressed Rebecca with its size and organization. Stalls housed a dozen horses of various breeds, from working quarter horses to thoroughbreds that looked like they belonged in Kentucky rather than Wyoming. The hayloft above contained enough feed to last through the harshest winter, and the tack room held saddles and equipment that represented a significant investment in quality gear. I maintain a breeding program for both horses and cattle, Jake explained as they moved through the facility. The goal is to develop stock that can thrive in this climate while meeting the demands of Eastern markets for quality beef and reliable working animals. The scientific approach to ranching impressed Rebecca, who'd grown up on farms where breeding was largely a matter of chance rather than careful planning. Jake's methods suggested education and experience that went beyond simple frontier pragmatism, reinforcing her sense that his background contained elements he hadn't fully explained. The cattle themselves were visible in nearby pastures, their thick winter coats evidence of good nutrition and careful management. Even in the harsh conditions following the blizzard, the animals appeared healthy and well cared for, with access to shelter and supplemental feed that would carry them through the coldest months ahead. "How many head do you run?" Rebecca asked, trying to calculate the scope of Jake's operation. "About 3,000 spread across 15 sections of land," Jake replied. "It's a size that allows for sustainable grazing while generating enough profit to support expansion and improvement." Part 3 Continuation. The unexpected encounter. The numbers were staggering to Rebecca, who'd struggled to maintain a single milk cow and a handful of chickens. 3,000 head of cattle represented wealth beyond anything she'd previously encountered. In the casual way Jake discussed his holdings suggested this was merely the foundation of his prosperity rather than its entirety. She found herself recalculating everything she thought she knew about his motivations for seeking marriage. "The land itself is worth more than the cattle," Jake continued as they walked toward a ridge that offered a panoramic view of his property. "I own the water rights to Bitter Creek and 2 of its major tributaries, which makes this some of the most valuable grazing land in the territory. Water is what determines success or failure out here, more than grass or climate or proximity to markets." The strategic thinking behind his land acquisitions impressed Rebecca almost as much as the scope of his holdings. Jake Morrison had clearly understood the fundamental economics of Western ranching from the beginning, positioning himself to control resources that other ranchers would need to access for their own survival. From the ridge, Rebecca could see fence lines that stretched to the horizon, marking boundaries that encompassed more land than some eastern counties. Ranch buildings dotted the landscape at strategic intervals, each one positioned to support specific aspects of the operation. Bunkhouses for the men, equipment barns for machinery, corrals for working cattle, and even what appeared to be a one-room schoolhouse in the distance. "You have a school?" she asked, pointing toward the small building that stood near a cluster of family homes. "3 of my men have wives and children," Jake explained. "I built the school so their children could receive proper education without having to board in town during the school year. The teacher is a young woman from Denver who wanted adventure on the frontier but didn't want to sacrifice her professional calling." The provision of educational facilities for employees' families spoke to a level of social responsibility that went far beyond typical employer obligations. Rebecca began to understand that Jake Morrison's ranch was less a business operation than a complete community, designed to be self-sufficient and capable of supporting multiple generations of families. "Where would our children fit into all this?" she asked, gesturing toward the complex infrastructure that surrounded them. "They'd attend school with the other ranch children, help with age-appropriate chores, and learn the skills they'd need to eventually manage portions of the operation themselves," Jake replied. "The goal would be to prepare them for leadership roles here, or to give them the education and experience they'd need to succeed anywhere they chose to go." The long-term thinking evident in his plans impressed Rebecca, who'd been so focused on immediate survival that she'd barely considered her children's future beyond the next winter. Jake was offering not just security but opportunity, the chance for Danny, Tommy, and eventually Emma to grow up with advantages that would prepare them for success in whatever paths they chose to follow. Danny had been listening to the conversation with the intense concentration of a child who understood that adult decisions would shape his entire future. "Mr. Morrison," he said with characteristic directness, "why do you want so many children?" Most grown-ups think kids are more trouble than they're worth. The question cut to the heart of what Rebecca had been wondering, but hadn't known how to ask tactfully. Jake's answer came with the honesty that seemed to characterize all his interactions with her family. Because I've spent 7 years building something that will outlast my lifetime, and I want to leave it to people who'll understand its value and continue improving it, he said simply. Money and land don't mean much if there's no one to inherit them, who shares your vision for what they could become. The philosophical depth of his response surprised Rebecca, revealing motivations that went beyond simple loneliness or practical considerations. Jake Morrison was thinking in terms of legacy and continuity, planning for generations he'd never lived to see but wanting to ensure his life's work would continue serving useful purposes long after his death. What about love? Tommy asked with the innocent directness that children brought to complex emotional questions. Don't you want kids because you love them, not just because you need someone to leave your ranch to? Jake's expression softened as he knelt to bring himself to Tommy's eye level, his weathered hands gentle as he placed them on the boy's small shoulders. Son, I believe love grows from spending time together, working toward common goals and caring about each other's welfare. I already feel protective of you and your brother and baby sister, because I can see what good people you are. Given time, that protection and respect would grow into the kind of love that makes real families strong. The distinction he drew between instant emotion and developed affection struck Rebecca as unusually mature for a man who'd apparently never raised children of his own. Jake understood that family bonds were built through shared experiences rather than magical connections, a perspective that boded well for his ability to form genuine relationships with adopted children. As they made their way back toward the main house, Rebecca found herself observing details that revealed the thoughtful planning behind every aspect of Jake's operation. Pathways were wide enough for wagons and positioned to minimize mud during spring thaws. Buildings were oriented to take advantage of natural wind patterns for cooling in summer and protection in winter. Even the landscaping around the house showed evidence of long-term thinking, with young trees planted in positions where they'd eventually provide shade and windbreaks. How long did it take you to plan all this? She asked, gesturing toward the carefully integrated elements of his ranch complex. I spent 2 years studying the land before I built anything permanent, Jake replied. I wanted to understand how water moved across the property, where the prevailing winds came from, how the seasons affected different areas. Most ranchers build first and adapt later, but I preferred to get it right from the beginning. The methodical approach to development aligned with everything else Rebecca had observed about Jake's character. He was clearly a man who thought several steps ahead, who planned for contingencies, and who preferred substantial solutions to temporary fixes. The trait that had made his ranch successful would presumably serve him well as a father to 7 children. Mrs. Chen appeared on the front porch as they approached the house, her face bright with the kind of news that transformed worried expressions into relieved smiles. Mrs. Thompson, she called, baby Emma is awake and asking for milk. Her fever is completely gone, and her breathing is clear. The announcement felt like a miracle to Rebecca, who'd spent days watching her daughter struggle with illness that could easily have proven fatal. Emma's recovery in less than 24 hours demonstrated the dramatic difference that proper medical care and adequate shelter could make in a child's health outcomes. Inside the nursery, Rebecca found Emma sitting up in the beautiful crib, her blue eyes bright with alertness that had been absent for days. The baby reached eagerly toward her mother, babbling in the content way that indicated she felt comfortable in her surroundings despite their unfamiliarity. The transformation was so complete that Rebecca might have doubted Emma had ever been seriously ill. The warm, humid air made all the difference, Mrs. Chen explained as Rebecca lifted her daughter from the crib. Children's lungs respond quickly to proper conditions, and babies are remarkably resilient when given the care they need. Jake stood in the doorway watching the reunion with an expression that Rebecca couldn't quite interpret. There was satisfaction there, certainly, and relief that his offer of shelter had achieved its intended purpose. But she also detected something deeper, a wistfulness that suggested the scene resonated with hopes or memories he didn't often allow himself to acknowledge. She looks like she belongs here, he said quietly, and Rebecca understood that the comment carried implications beyond mere observation about Emma's comfort in the nursery. The afternoon brought the planned visit to the county orphanage, a journey that would introduce Rebecca to 2 of the 4 boys Jake hoped to bring into their expanded family. The orphanage was located in a converted warehouse on the outskirts of Cedar Falls. Its institutional appearance softened only by attempts at decoration that couldn't quite disguise the building's original commercial purpose. Mrs. Patterson, the orphanage director, met them at the entrance with the harried efficiency of a woman managing too many children with too few resources. She was a thin, middle-aged woman whose kind eyes couldn't quite hide the exhaustion that came from constant worry about the welfare of children entrusted to her care. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice carrying obvious relief at his appearance, "I'm so pleased you've come. Benjamin and Joseph have been hoping for good news about permanent placement, and I believe they'll be perfect additions to your family." The boys in question appeared moments later, having been coached to present themselves favorably to potential adoptive parents. Benjamin, at 9 years old, was tall for his age, but painfully thin, his clothes clean but obviously handed down from larger children. His younger brother Joseph, barely 6, stayed close to Benjamin's side with the instinctive wariness of a child who'd learned that adults couldn't always be trusted to provide security. "Boys," Mrs. Patterson said with encouraging gentleness, "this is Mr. Morrison, who I've told you about, and Mrs. Thompson, who might become your new mother if everything works out well." Benjamin stepped forward with the serious dignity of a child who'd been forced to grow up too quickly, extending his hand for a formal handshake that impressed Rebecca with its maturity. "Pleased to meet you, sir, ma'am. Joseph and I are grateful for your consideration." The formal politeness of his greeting broke Rebecca's heart, revealing how thoroughly these children had learned to present themselves as worthy of adult approval rather than simply expecting unconditional care. She knelt to bring herself to both boys' eye level, wanting to communicate warmth rather than evaluation. "I'm pleased to meet you both," she said with genuine sincerity. "Mr. Morrison has told me wonderful things about you, and I'm hoping we can all get to know each other better." Joseph, who'd been silent during the introductions, suddenly spoke up with the directness that seemed characteristic of children his age. "Are you really going to be our mama? Benjamin says maybe we'll finally have a real family instead of just living with strangers who get paid to feed us." The raw hope in the little boy's voice made Rebecca's throat tight with emotion. These children had experienced losses and disappointments that no child should have to endure, yet they remained capable of hoping for better circumstances. Their resilience was both inspiring and heartbreaking. "We're here to see if we'd all be happy together," Rebecca said carefully, not wanting to make promises she might not be able to keep. "What would you like to know about us?" The questions that followed revealed the practical concerns of children who'd learned to evaluate potential placements based on experience with disappointment. Would there be enough food every day? Would they be expected to work beyond their physical capabilities? Would they be separated if circumstances changed? Would their new parents treat them differently than their biological children? Jake answered each question with the patience of a man who understood that trust had to be earned through consistency rather than promised through words. He described the ranch's educational opportunities, the recreational activities available to children, and the long-term security that came with legal adoption. But more importantly, he spoke to the boys as individuals rather than interchangeable charity cases, asking about their interests and dreams with genuine curiosity. "Benjamin enjoys reading and has shown aptitude for mathematics," Mrs. Patterson added helpfully. "Joseph is fascinated by animals and spends hours caring for the orphanage's chickens and goats. Both boys are well-behaved and eager to please." The institutional language used to describe the children's attributes reminded Rebecca uncomfortably of livestock evaluations, though she understood the director's need to present them favorably to potential adoptive families. Still, it reinforced her determination to ensure that any children who joined their family would be valued for their individual personalities rather than their usefulness or convenience. The tour of the orphanage's facilities revealed conditions that were adequate but far from ideal. Children slept in dormitory-style rooms with minimal privacy, ate meals in a communal dining hall that emphasized efficiency over comfort, and spent their days in structured activities designed more for crowd control than individual development. The staff was clearly well-intentioned but overwhelmed by the sheer number of children requiring care. "How many children do you currently house?" Jake asked as they observed a group of youngsters engaged in supervised play. 43 at present," Mrs. Patterson replied with obvious strain. "We're designed for 30,
but the demand continues to exceed our capacity. Winter is always our most challenging season, as families struggling with their own survival sometimes find themselves unable to care for additional children. The numbers painted a sobering picture of frontier life's impact on families, reminding Rebecca that her own struggles were part of a broader pattern of hardship that affected entire communities. Children like Benjamin and Joseph were casualties of economic conditions and social instability that left too many families unable to maintain their integrity. "What happens to children who aren't adopted?" Rebecca asked, though she suspected she might not want to hear the answer. "Boys typically become indentured servants or apprentices when they reach age 12. Mrs. Patterson explained matter-of-factly. "Girls often find employment as domestic help, though their situations can be more precarious. We try to ensure proper treatment, but our ability to monitor long-term placements is limited." The bleak future facing unadopted children made Rebecca's decision feel even more urgent. Benjamin and Joseph faced the possibility of being separated and sent to work for strangers who might or might not treat them kindly. The chance to become part of a loving family represented salvation from a system that viewed them as burdens to be managed rather than individuals deserving of care and opportunity. As their visit concluded, Jake made arrangements to return within the week with legal documents that would begin the adoption process. The speed with which he moved to secure the boy's future impressed Rebecca, though it also reinforced her sense that he'd been planning this expansion of his household for some time. "Can we come see your ranch before we move there?" Benjamin asked with the careful politeness that characterized all his interactions with adults. "Joseph gets scared in new places, and it might help if he could see where we'd be living." "Of course," Jake replied without hesitation. "In fact, I'd prefer that you both spend a few days with us before we make any permanent arrangements. You need to be sure you'd be comfortable in our family, just as we need to be sure we can provide what you need." The mutual evaluation he proposed struck Rebecca as evidence of his genuine concern for the children's welfare, rather than mere desire to acquire a ready-made family. Jake Morrison was approaching adoption with the same careful planning he'd applied to his ranch development, ensuring that all parties understood and accepted the responsibilities they were undertaking. The drive back to the Morning Star Ranch passed in thoughtful silence as Rebecca processed what she'd learned about the children who might become her sons. Benjamin and Joseph were clearly good boys who deserved better circumstances than the orphanage could provide, but they'd also been shaped by experiences that would require patience and understanding to address. Building genuine family bonds with children who'd learned to guard their emotions would be a challenge that demanded more than good intentions. "What are you thinking?" Jake asked as they neared his property. "I'm thinking about how much responsibility we'd be taking on," Rebecca replied honestly. 7 children, each with his own personality and needs and history of loss. It's not just about providing food and shelter, it's about helping them learn to trust again, to believe in the possibility of permanent family connections. Jake nodded with what looked like approval at her thoughtful response. "That's exactly why I wanted you to meet them first. This decision has to be made with full understanding of what we'd be committing to, for their sake as much as ours." As they approached the ranch house where Danny and Tommy waited with Mrs. Chen, Rebecca felt the weight of decision pressing down on her with increasing intensity. Jake Morrison's proposal offered security and opportunity beyond anything she could provide alone, but it also represented a complete transformation of her identity and her children's future. The choice she made in the next few days would determine not just her own fate, but the lives of 7 children who deserved the best possible chance at happiness and success. The evening meal that night felt like a preview of what family life might become if she accepted Jake's proposal. The dining room that had seemed intimidatingly formal that morning now felt welcoming as Mrs. Chen served a feast that included everyone's favorite foods. Danny and Tommy chatted excitedly about their exploration of the ranch buildings, while Emma babbled contentedly in her high chair, and Jake listened to their stories with the patience of a man genuinely interested in children's perspectives. For the first time since Michael's death, Rebecca found herself imagining a future that held more than mere survival. The vision of 7 sons growing up together on this prosperous ranch, receiving education and opportunities that would prepare them for successful adult lives, felt like something worth sacrificing her independence to achieve. The question that remained was whether she possessed the courage to trust her family's future to a man she'd known for less than a week, regardless of how impressive his character and resources appeared to be. Part 4. Cautious Cooperation. The second morning at the Morning Star Ranch dawned with crystalline clarity that made the snow-covered landscape sparkle like scattered diamonds. Rebecca woke to the sound of men's voices drifting up from the ranch yard as Jake's employees began their daily routines, and the comforting knowledge that her children were safe and warm in beds that hadn't existed in their lives just days before. The transformation felt surreal, as if she'd stepped through some invisible barrier into a world where abundance replaced scarcity and security supplanted constant worry. Emma had slept through the night for the first time in weeks, her breathing clear and her appetite returned with a vengeance that delighted Mrs. Chen. The housekeeper had taken particular pleasure in preparing special foods designed to help the baby regain the weight she'd lost during her illness, and Emma's eager response to soft porridge and warm milk suggested her recovery was complete. Rebecca found Jake in his study after breakfast, working at a massive oak desk that dominated one corner of a room lined with more books than she'd seen outside the Cedar Falls Library. The sight of him bent over correspondence, his reading glasses perched on his nose and his sleeves rolled up for serious work, struck her as unexpectedly intimate. This was Jake Morrison, the businessman rather than the public figure, and his obvious intelligence and attention to detail reinforced her growing respect for his capabilities. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said from the doorway, uncertain whether his work required privacy. "Not at all," Jake replied, rising with the automatic courtesy that seemed to govern all his interactions with women. "I was just reviewing the legal documents we'll need for the adoptions. Please, come in and sit down. There are several matters we should discuss before you make your final decision." The study felt like a sanctuary designed for serious thought and important conversations. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves held volumes on subjects ranging from cattle breeding to classical literature, while windows offered views of the ranch operations that were clearly visible from Jake's private workspace. A fireplace provided warmth that made the room feel cozy despite its impressive size, and the furniture was arranged to encourage conversation rather than formal meetings. "What kind of legal matters?" Rebecca asked as she settled into a leather chair that was more comfortable than anything she'd ever owned. "Adoption proceedings for all the children, including Danny and Tommy," Jake explained, spreading several documents across his desk. "Marriage contracts that specify property rights and inheritance provisions. Guardianship papers that would protect the children's interests if anything happened to either of us. The goal is to ensure everyone's security through proper legal documentation." The thoroughness of his preparation impressed Rebecca, while simultaneously making her aware of how much she didn't understand about the legal complexities of blended families. Her marriage to Michael had been simple by comparison, involving little more than a church ceremony and a brief conversation with the county clerk about filing the appropriate papers. "What happens to my homestead if I marry you?" she asked, suddenly realizing she'd been so focused on immediate concerns that she'd neglected to consider the fate of Michael's dream. "That depends on what you want to happen," Jake replied. "We could sell it to help fund improvements here, or we could maintain it as a separate property that might serve as inheritance for one of the boys when they come of age. The land itself has value, even if the current buildings aren't suitable for year-round habitation." The possibility that Michael's homestead might eventually belong to one of her sons felt like a way to honor his memory while acknowledging current realities. Danny or Tommy could grow up understanding their connection to their father's dreams, even if those dreams were fulfilled in ways Michael had never imagined. "I'd like to keep the land," Rebecca said after considering the options. "Maybe someday one of the boys will want to build something there, to carry forward their father's vision in their own way." Jake nodded approvingly at her decision. "We can arrange for periodic maintenance of the property, maybe even rebuild the cabin as a hunting lodge or summer retreat. The important thing is preserving the option for future generations." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion in the ranch yard that drew both their attention to the windows. A wagon had arrived carrying two passengers who appeared to be engaged in animated conversation with several of Jake's men. Rebecca recognized Dr. Foster immediately, but the second figure was unfamiliar until Jake's expression brightened with obvious pleasure. "That's Lucas Walsh," he said, moving toward the window for a better view. "I asked his relatives to bring him for a visit so you could meet him before making your decision. He's the 10-year-old whose parents died in the wagon accident." Rebecca studied the boy through the glass, noting his sturdy build and the way he interacted confidently with the ranch hands who'd gathered around the wagon. Even at a distance, Lucas projected the kind of self-assurance that suggested he'd adapted well to challenging circumstances, though she suspected his apparent confidence might hide emotional scars that would require patience to address. "He looks older than 10, she observed, watching as Lucas helped unload supplies from the wagon with the competence of someone accustomed to adult responsibilities. "Life has a way of aging children quickly out here," Jake replied with what sounded like personal experience. "Lucas has
been working alongside grown men since his parents' death, helping support his extended family by taking on tasks that should belong to someone twice his age." The mention of Lucas's work situation reminded Rebecca that her decision would affect children who were currently contributing to their family's survival through their own labor. Bringing them to the ranch would improve their individual circumstances but might create hardships for the relatives who'd been depending on their assistance. "What about his aunt and uncle?" she asked. "Can they manage without his help?" "I've made arrangements to compensate them for the loss of his labor," Jake said simply. "Their willingness to let him go depends partly on knowing they won't suffer financially from his absence." The practical consideration of Lucas's economic value to his current family struck Rebecca as another example of Jake's thorough planning. He'd apparently thought through all the potential consequences of his adoption plans, ensuring that his actions would benefit everyone involved rather than simply transferring problems from one household to another. They made their way outside to greet the visitors, and Rebecca's first impression of Lucas Walsh was of a boy who'd been forced to grow up too quickly, but had managed to retain essential optimism despite his losses. He was indeed tall for his age, with calloused hands that spoke of hard work and intelligent brown eyes that assessed new situations with the wariness of someone who'd learned to be cautious about trusting adults. "Ma'am," he said, removing his worn hat with the automatic politeness frontier children learned early. "I'm pleased to meet you. Mr. Morrison says you might be willing to let me join your family." The formal politeness of his greeting reminded Rebecca of Benjamin's careful manners at the orphanage, another indication of how thoroughly these children had learned to present themselves as worthy of adult approval. She found herself wanting to encourage more natural interaction, to help them understand that family relationships were built on affection rather than performance. "I'm pleased to meet you too, Lucas," she replied warmly. "Mr. Morrison has told me about your situation, and I'm hoping we can all spend some time getting to know each other." Lucas's uncle, a weathered man named Tom Walsh, approached with the kind of reluctant gratitude that suggested he understood the benefits of Jake's offer while regretting the circumstances that made it necessary. "Mrs. Thompson, I want you to know that Lucas is a good boy who's never given us a moment's trouble. He works hard, minds his manners, and deserves better opportunities than we can provide." The endorsement was clearly heartfelt, though Rebecca detected underlying sadness at the prospect of losing a child who'd become an integral part of the Walsh family structure. She realized that Lucas's adoption would represent another loss for people who'd already endured their share of hardship. "How do you feel about the possibility of living here?" Rebecca asked Lucas directly, wanting to understand his perspective rather than simply accepting adult assessments of his situation. Lucas looked around the ranch complex with obvious appreciation for its size and organization, but his answer revealed deeper considerations than mere material improvement. "I'd miss Uncle Tom and Aunt Sarah, but I understand they've got their own children to worry about. If living here means I could go to school regular and maybe learn things that would help me make a good living someday, I reckon it's worth considering." The mature reasoning behind his response impressed Rebecca, though it also reinforced her awareness of how much responsibility these children carried for their own futures. Lucas was evaluating Jake's offer based on long-term benefits rather than immediate comfort, demonstrating the kind of practical thinking that would serve him well regardless of which family he joined. Danny and Tommy appeared from the direction of the barn, their faces flushed with excitement from whatever adventure they'd been pursuing among the ranch buildings. Their obvious comfort in their temporary home was evident in their relaxed postures and easy interaction with Jake's employees, suggesting they were already beginning to think of the Morning Star Ranch as their territory.
Lucas, Tommy called out with the instant friendliness that characterized his approach to most new situations. Want to see the horses? Mr. Morrison said. We could watch them being groomed if we stayed out of the way. The invitation was accepted eagerly, and Rebecca found herself watching as three boys who might become brothers began the process of establishing relationships that could last their entire lives. Lucas's initial wariness seemed to diminish as Danny and Tommy shared their discoveries about ranch life, and their natural camaraderie suggested that friendship would develop easily among children who shared similar backgrounds and experiences. Dr. Foster approached Rebecca as the boys headed toward the barn, his weathered face serious with concerns that went beyond mere social pleasantries. Mrs. Thompson, I wanted to speak with you about the medical considerations of caring for a large family in this remote location. The practical reminder of potential health challenges hadn't occurred to Rebecca, though it should have been obvious that 7 children would inevitably face illnesses and injuries that would require professional attention. Her experience with Emma's recent pneumonia had demonstrated how quickly children's conditions could deteriorate without proper care. What kind of preparations would we need to make? She asked, grateful for his professional perspective on potential problems. Basic medical supplies, certainly, and training in emergency procedures, Dr. Foster replied. But more importantly, you'd need agreements with neighboring families about mutual assistance during medical crises. When you're responsible for 7 children, you can't afford to handle emergencies alone. The doctor's advice reminded Rebecca that accepting Jake's proposal would mean becoming part of a broader community network rather than simply joining his household. Large families required extensive support systems, and her success as a mother to 7 boys would depend partly on her ability to build relationships with other women who could provide assistance when circumstances demanded it. Jake had been listening to their conversation while also monitoring the boys' exploration of the barn, and his next comment revealed another aspect of his planning that Rebecca hadn't considered. I've arranged for Mrs. Chen to train you in advanced first aid and basic medical procedures. She has considerable experience treating injuries and illnesses, and her knowledge would be invaluable for managing common childhood problems. The practical education he was offering felt like another gift that would benefit Rebecca regardless of what decision she ultimately made about marriage. Medical knowledge was always valuable on the frontier, where professional help might be hours or days away when emergencies struck. Mrs. Chen's willingness to share her expertise suggested that Jake's household staff understood they were being asked to help integrate new family members rather than simply serve additional residents. The afternoon brought the arrival of David Cartwright, the 7-year-old whose family had lost everything in a fire. Rebecca's first glimpse of the child struck her heart with immediate sympathy, as his small frame and serious expression spoke of someone who'd experienced loss that most adults would struggle to process. David had been brought by the rancher who'd employed him since his family's disaster, and the man's obvious reluctance to part with the boy suggested David had proven himself valuable despite his young age. David's got natural instincts with animals, explained Mr. Peterson, the rancher who'd been caring for the boy. He can gentle a spooked horse better than most grown men, and he's never met a cow he couldn't handle. But he needs more than I can give him. He needs education and the chance to be a child sometimes instead of always working. The assessment painted a picture of a boy whose talents had been recognized and utilized but whose broader development had been neglected due to practical necessities. David's skills with livestock would certainly be valuable on Jake's ranch, but Rebecca was more concerned with ensuring he received the childhood experiences he'd been forced to sacrifice. David himself was almost painfully shy when introduced to Rebecca, his responses limited to whispered yes or no answers that suggested either natural reticence or learned wariness about trusting new adults. His clothes were clean but obviously work-oriented, and his hands showed the calluses that came from handling ropes and tools designed for larger users. "Hello, David," Rebecca said gently, kneeling to bring herself to his eye level. "I've heard wonderful things about your way with animals. Would you like to show me some of the horses here?" The invitation seemed to surprise the boy, who glanced uncertainly at Mr. Peterson before nodding his acceptance. His obvious need for permission before engaging in simple activities suggested he'd learned to be extremely careful about overstepping boundaries in his current placement. As they walked toward the pasture where several horses grazed peacefully in the afternoon sun, David's initial shyness began to diminish. His expertise with animals was evident in the way the horses responded to his approach, moving toward him with the trust that indicated previous positive interactions. When he spoke to the animals, his voice carried a confidence that was notably absent from his conversations with humans. "That's Buttercup," he said, pointing to a gentle mare who'd approached the fence. "She likes to have her nose rubbed, but you got to be careful not to startle her because she's expecting a foal come spring." The detailed knowledge he displayed about individual animals' personalities and conditions impressed Rebecca, revealing intelligence and observational skills that would serve him well in any number of future pursuits. David clearly possessed natural talents that deserved cultivation through proper education and encouragement. "How did you learn so much about horses?" Rebecca asked, genuinely curious about his background. "My papa taught me before the fire," David replied, his voice growing softer as he mentioned his father. "He said animals could teach you things about trust and patience that people sometimes forget. I've been trying to remember everything he showed me." The poignant reference to preserving his father's lessons struck Rebecca as evidence of David's fundamental strength of character. Despite his losses and current difficult circumstances, he remained committed to honoring his parents' memory through practical application of inherited knowledge. The boys had naturally gravitated toward each other during the afternoon, and Rebecca found herself observing the dynamics that developed as Danny, Tommy, Lucas, and David negotiated the social interactions that would determine their relationships. Lucas emerged as something of a natural leader, his greater age and experience giving him authority that the younger boys seemed to accept willingly. David's expertise with animals earned him immediate respect, while the twins' enthusiasm and energy contributed to the group's overall cohesion. "They're getting along well," Jake observed as they watched the four boys collaborate on some project involving ropes and fence posts. That's not always the case when children from different backgrounds are brought together. The positive group dynamics were certainly encouraging, but Rebecca knew that real compatibility would take time to develop. Children could be polite and cooperative during brief visits while harboring reservations or conflicts that would only emerge during extended cohabitation. Still, the absence of obvious personality clashes or territorial disputes was a hopeful sign for future family harmony. As evening approached and preparations began for David's return to Mr. Peterson's ranch, Rebecca found herself increasingly aware that her decision deadline was approaching rapidly. Tomorrow was Sunday, the day she'd promised to give Jake her final answer about his unprecedented proposal. The children she'd met all deserved better circumstances than their current situations provided, and Jake's ranch offered opportunities that would transform their prospects in ways that went far beyond mere material improvement. Yet accepting his proposal would mean abandoning her independence and entrusting her family's future to a man she'd known for less than a week. Despite his apparent character and obvious resources, Jake Morrison remained largely mysterious in terms of personal history and deeper motivations. She was being asked to make a leap of faith that would affect not just her own life but the destinies of 7 children who deserved the most thoughtful decision possible. "Mrs. Thompson," David said quietly, as he prepared to leave with Mr. Peterson, "if you decide to let me come live here, I promise I'll work real hard and never cause trouble. I just want to belong somewhere again." The simple honesty of his plea crystallized everything Rebecca had been feeling about Jake's proposal. These weren't abstract decisions about marriage and adoption. They were choices that would determine whether 4 boys received the security and opportunities they needed to build successful lives. Her personal concerns about independence and autonomy seemed selfish when weighed against such fundamental human needs. That evening, as she tucked Danny and Tommy into beds that were larger and more comfortable than anything they'd ever known, Rebecca listened to their excited chatter about the day's discoveries and their hopes for the future. Their obvious happiness at the prospect of staying at the ranch permanently was evident in every word they spoke, and their easy acceptance of the other boys as potential brothers demonstrated the remarkable adaptability that children brought to changing circumstances. "Mama," Danny said as she kissed him goodnight, "are you going to marry Mr. Morrison? Because Lucas and David really need families, and we could all be brothers together." The earnest hope in her son's voice reminded Rebecca that her children had already made their choice about the future they wanted. They'd embraced Jake's proposal with the wholehearted enthusiasm that came from recognizing genuine opportunity when it appeared. Her own hesitations were based on adult complexities that meant little to children who simply wanted security and the chance to grow up in a real family. As she settled into her own bed that night, Rebecca found herself mentally rehearsing the conversation she would have with Jake the following day. The practical arguments all favored accepting his proposal, the children's welfare demanded it, and her own feelings toward him had developed beyond mere gratitude into something that might eventually become love. The question that remained was whether she possessed the courage to trust that his promise of 7 sons by Christmas represented genuine commitment rather than impulsive generosity that might fade when faced with the daily realities of raising a large family. Outside her window, the Wyoming wind carried the sounds of a working ranch settling down for the night, and for the first time since Michael's death, Rebecca fell asleep to the comforting knowledge that her children were safe, warm, and surrounded by people who cared about their welfare. Whether that security would become permanent depended on the decision she would announce tomorrow, a choice that would echo through generations yet to come. The clock in Jake's study chimed 11 times as Rebecca sat across from him, her hands trembling slightly as she held the letter that had arrived with the afternoon mail. The envelope bore the seal of a Denver law firm, and its contents had just shattered everything she thought she understood about Jake Morrison's proposal. The paper crackled in the silence as she read the words again, hoping somehow they would change their meaning. "You're already married," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Elizabeth Hartwell isn't dead. She's been living in Denver this entire time, and according to this letter, she's ready to return to Wyoming to claim her place as your wife." Jake's face had gone ashen when she'd shown him the correspondence, and now he sat rigidly in his chair, his weathered hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had turned white. The confident demeanor that had carried him through their courtship had crumbled entirely, replaced by the haunted expression of a man whose carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. "Rebecca, let me explain," he began, but she held up her hand to stop him. 7 years, she continued, her voice growing stronger with rising anger. 7 years you let everyone believe she was dead. 7 years, you've been living as a widower building sympathy in this community, all while your legal wife was alive and well in Colorado. And now you have the audacity to propose marriage to me when you can't legally marry anyone. The magnitude of Jake's deception was staggering. Rebecca had been prepared to entrust her children's futures to a man who was living a fundamental lie, whose entire persona had been built on a fiction that could destroy not just her family but the other boys he claimed to want to rescue. The betrayal cut deeper than Michael's death because at least that loss had been honest. Jake rose from his chair and moved to the window, staring out at the ranch he'd built while constructing his elaborate deception. "Elizabeth and I had problems before she left for Denver. She couldn't adapt to frontier life, couldn't accept the isolation and hardship that came with building something from nothing. When the opportunity arose for her to return to her family's business interests in the city, she took it without discussing the decision with me." "So you simply declared her dead?" Rebecca's incredulity made her voice sharp. "You allowed the entire territory to believe she'd perished in some railroad accident while she was actually choosing to live apart from you. She wanted the separation as much as I did," Jake said defensively. "We agreed that divorce would be too scandalous for both our reputations, so we simply lived separately. She had her life in Denver, and I had mine here. It seemed like a reasonable solution at the time." The rationalization revealed a side of Jake's character that Rebecca found deeply disturbing. The man who'd impressed her with his integrity and straightforward dealing had been living a lie sophisticated enough to fool an entire community for years. If he could maintain such an elaborate deception about something as fundamental as his marital status, what other secrets might he be hiding? "What changed?" Rebecca asked, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. "Why is she returning now after all these years?" Jake's shoulders sagged as he turned back to face her, and for the first time since she'd known him, he looked older than his years. "Her father died last month. His will included provisions that require her to return to her legal marriage in order to inherit her portion of the family fortune. Apparently, he disapproved of our separation and structured his estate to force reconciliation." The sordid details of financial manipulation and family pressure painted Jake's marriage in an even uglier light. Rebecca began to understand that his proposal to her hadn't been motivated by genuine affection or even practical necessity, but by desperation to avoid confronting the legal and social complications of his actual wife's return. "So I was what, exactly?" Rebecca's voice carried a bitterness she'd never heard from herself before. "A convenient replacement to help you maintain the fiction of your widowhood. Someone naive enough to believe your promises about 7 sons and security for my children." "It wasn't like that," Jake protested. But the weakness of his denial only reinforced Rebecca's growing conviction that she'd been systematically deceived by a man whose charm masked profound dishonesty. The sound of children's voices drifted up from the main floor, where Danny and Tommy were playing with baby Emma while Mrs. Chin prepared dinner. Their laughter felt like mockery now, a reminder of how close Rebecca had come to destroying their futures by trusting a man whose word proved worthless when tested by inconvenient truths. "What about the other boys?" she demanded. "Lucas and David and the brothers at the orphanage. Were they just props in your elaborate charade? Children you planned to collect to make your fake family more convincing?" Jake's face flushed with what looked like genuine shame. "My feelings for those children are real. I do want to help them, to give them opportunities they wouldn't have otherwise. That part of my proposal was completely sincere." "Your sincerity means nothing when it's built on lies," Rebecca shot back. "Those boys need real families, not theatrical productions designed to help you avoid the consequences of your own cowardice." The harsh assessment struck home, and Jake flinched as if she'd slapped him. But Rebecca felt no sympathy for his discomfort. He'd endangered not just her own welfare, but the futures of 7 children who deserved honesty and commitment rather than manipulation and self-serving deception. "When does Elizabeth arrive?" Rebecca asked, already beginning to calculate what she would need to do to extricate her family from this disaster. "Next week," Jake admitted. "She's traveling with lawyers who will presumably want to examine the ranch's financial records and ensure that marital property has been properly maintained during our separation." The timeline gave Rebecca precious little opportunity to make alternative arrangements for her family's welfare. Winter was settling in with increasing severity. Their original homestead remained uninhabitable, and she had no resources beyond what Jake had provided during their brief stay at his ranch. Elizabeth Hartwell's return would not only end any possibility of marriage, but would likely result in Rebecca and her children being expelled from the only warm shelter they'd known in months. "I need to leave," Rebecca said, rising from her chair with sudden determination. "Tonight, before Elizabeth arrives and discovers that her husband has been entertaining another woman and her children in their marital home." Jake moved quickly to block her path to the door, his expression desperate with the realization that his comfortable arrangements were crumbling beyond repair. "Rebecca, please. There has to be a way to work this out. Elizabeth might be willing to accept a more flexible arrangement, especially if the financial benefits are substantial enough." The suggestion that his legal wife might be bribed into tolerating his quasi-bigamous relationship struck Rebecca as the final evidence of Jake Morrison's moral bankruptcy. He was proposing to turn her into some kind of kept woman, dependent on the generosity of a legal wife who'd been deceived about her husband's activities during their years of separation. "You're suggesting I become your mistress while remaining in Elizabeth's home." Rebecca's disgust was evident in every word. "That I raise my children in an atmosphere of deception and compromise, teaching them that dishonesty is acceptable when it serves our convenience." "It wouldn't be like that," Jake said, but his protest lacked conviction even to his own ears. "It would be exactly like that," Rebecca replied with finality. "And I won't subject my children to such corruption, no matter how comfortable the physical circumstances might be." She moved past him toward the door, her mind already focused on the practical challenges of departing the ranch in winter weather with 3 young children and no resources beyond the clothes they'd brought from their failed homestead. The difficulties ahead seemed almost insurmountable, but they were preferable to remaining in a situation built on lies that could collapse at any moment. "Where will you go?" Jake asked, his voice carrying what sounded like genuine concern despite the circumstances that had created their crisis. "That's no longer your concern," Rebecca replied coldly. "You've forfeited any right to worry about our welfare through your deception and selfishness." As she climbed the stairs to gather her children and their few possessions, Rebecca felt a familiar despair settling over her like a heavy blanket. Once again, adult failures had created impossible circumstances for children who deserved security and honest care. Danny and Tommy would have to leave the first comfortable home they'd known since their father's death, while baby Emma would return to conditions that had nearly cost her life just days earlier. But even as she acknowledged the hardships ahead, Rebecca felt a grim satisfaction in choosing honesty over comfortable lies. Whatever challenges awaited her family, they would face them with dignity rather than becoming accessories to someone else's elaborate deception. The confident cowboy who'd promised 7 sons by Christmas had proven that some promises were too good to be true, especially when they came from men whose character was as false as their circumstances. The blizzard that began falling as Rebecca loaded her children into the old wagon seemed like nature's commentary on the disaster that Jake Morrison's deception had created. But as she guided their meager transportation away from the Morning Star Ranch and toward an uncertain future, Rebecca held her head high with the knowledge that she'd chosen truth over comfort, integrity over security. Some prices were too high to pay, even when the alternative was a return to poverty and struggle that might yet claim everything she held dear. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.